It's 5:30 in the morning on Sunday, September 2nd, 1666. A fire has broken out in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Street in London. It's unclear how the fire began, but what is clear is that it will soon be out of control. High winds will spread the flames, which will quickly engulf an entire street, and then another, and then another. This is London's legendary fire, also known as the Great Fire of London. And over the next 5 days, it will completely change the city forever. The most important thing to understand about the Great Fire is just how densely packed London was at the time. Today, London feels like a sprawling metropolis, but back then, its population of around 800,000 people were crammed into just 10 square miles, about half the area of Manhattan. The streets were narrow and winding, with dilapidated buildings crowding close together. There were few open spaces and no parks. Every available inch of land was used for housing or business. So when the fire began, it had nowhere to go. Fires weren't uncommon in London. In fact, there had already been 47 fires that year. But this one would be much worse than the others, because of where it started, right in the middle of town. The fire began in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Street, near the wholesale food markets. Given the poor construction of the buildings and the flammable nature of the commodities stored there, the fire quickly spread. By the afternoon, an entire street was destroyed, and by midnight, the fire had spread all the way to Pudding Street. To make matters worse, Londoners hadn't yet invented a proper firefighting service. Instead, they relied on bucket brigades, groups of volunteers who would form human chains to pass buckets of water from well to burning building. At first, these efforts seemed successful. The firefighters managed to keep the blaze contained for several hours. But then the wind picked up and fanned the flames, allowing them to jump from roof to roof and devour entire city blocks at a time. By Monday morning, the fire had reached the busy commercial district along the River Thames. Entire wharves full of merchant ships were ablaze, sending thick black smoke billowing into the sky. To the north, the fire swept through the fashionable district of West End. To the south, it moved toward the bustling borough of Southwark. People desperately ran for the hills, abandoning their homes and businesses. Those who could flee quickly enough were forced to watch helplessly as their world burned to the ground. One eyewitness described the scene perfectly. The very heart of the city was a fiery furnace, the hotter because all around it were heaps of combustible matter ready to take fire. In a word, never was there a more dreadful sight to be seen nor conceived to be possible in the city. As the fire spread, people desperately tried to salvage whatever they could. Some carried their children out of the city on their backs. Others led their livestock to safety. Many simply stood around watching their homes turn to ash. But the majority of Londoners didn't stick around to find out. They fled to the countryside or to nearby towns like Oxford or Cambridge. Historians estimate that around 1/5 of London's population was displaced, leaving behind some 100,000 people dead or alive. Meanwhile, the fire continued to spread. For 4 more days, it roared through the heart of London, consuming everything in its path. By the time it was done, it had destroyed 13,000 houses, 80 churches, and numerous public buildings, including the famous 1320 London Bridge. In total, the fire had covered an area of roughly 2 square miles, an area so large that it can still be seen today from Google Earth. When the smoke finally cleared, Londoners were left stunned and disoriented. The destruction was so complete that many people couldn't recognize their own neighborhoods. All around them were piles of rubble and debris. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay. Survivors wandered the streets in shock, unsure of what to do next. But slowly but surely, life began to return to normal. People began to clear the debris and rebuild their homes. Businesses reopened and trade resumed. Within months, London was back in business, though it would never be the same again. The immediate impact of the fire was devastating. Thousands of people were left homeless, and the economy was in sharp decline. But over time, Londoners began to see the benefits of the disaster. First and foremost, the fire had eliminated London's slums. Much of the city's housing stock had been old, dilapidated, and unsanitary. Now it could be replaced with new, modern buildings. Secondly, the fire had given London a chance to start over. Before the fire, the city had been overcrowded, polluted, and chaotic. Now it could be rebuilt according to a new plan, a plan that would make it wider, more orderly, and more attractive. Finally, the fire had made London more prosperous. Before the fire, London had been a victim of its own success. Its population had grown too large, its housing stock inadequate, and its streets too narrow. But after the fire, London was able to address these problems. The population stabilized, new housing was built, and the streets were widened. As a result, London became a much more pleasant place to live and work. Of course, these changes didn't happen overnight. It took decades for London to recover from the fire. But in the long run, the benefits were undeniable. Let's take a look at some of the ways the Great Fire changed London. The most obvious change was the rebuilding of the city. After the fire, London was in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been wiped off the map. But over the next few decades, the city was rebuilt, stone by stone. The new London was wider, more orderly, and more attractive than the old. New streets were cut through the old neighborhoods. New buildings were erected in the place of the old, and new parks and open spaces were created. One of the most important changes was the construction of new housing. Before the fire, London's housing stock had been old, dilapidated, and unsanitary. But after the fire, Londoners had a chance to start over. They built new, more modern housing that was more spacious, more sanitary, and more fireproof. These changes helped to improve the quality of life for Londoners and also made the city more attractive to new residents. Another important change was the introduction of new building materials. Before the fire, most buildings in London had been constructed out of wood. But after the fire, Londoners began to use brick and stone more frequently. These materials were more expensive, but they were also more fireproof. That meant that if another fire broke out, it wouldn't be nearly as destructive. And finally, there were the intangible changes. In many ways, the Great Fire of London was a blessing in disguise. It may have leveled much of the city, but it also gave Londoners a chance to start over and create a new, better London. The city was never the same after the fire. In fact, it emerged as one of the most prosperous and influential cities in the world. Now let's answer some questions you might have about the Great Fire of London. Why did the fire start? Unfortunately, we don't know exactly how the fire began. All we know is that it started in Thomas Farron's bakery on Pudding Street. How long did the fire last? The fire lasted for 5 days, from September 2nd, 1666 to September 6th, 1666. How many people died? We don't know exactly how many people died in the fire, but historians estimate that around 100,000 people were killed, either by the fire itself or by the diseases that followed. What caused the fire to spread so quickly? The fire spread so quickly because of the high winds and the dense construction of the buildings. What was the impact of the fire on London? The fire had a devastating impact on London. It killed or displaced around 1/5 of the city's population and destroyed around 13,000 houses, 80 churches, and numerous public buildings. How did London recover from the fire? It took decades for London to recover from the fire, but eventually the city was rebuilt, and it was wider, more orderly, and more attractive than before. What can we learn from the Great Fire of London? There are many lessons we can learn from the Great Fire of London, but perhaps the most important is the importance of planning. If Londoners had had a proper plan in place for dealing with fires, the damage might not have been so extensive. Well, that's all for now. But if you want to learn more about the Great Fire of London, be sure to check out the additional resources. Thanks for watching.